We're just gonna fire off, everybody. Is this thing on? Mic check, check, check. Mic Swiss. Danish person. Oh, check. I'll be here all week. All right, so this panel is on games as cultural touchstones. I'll let the panel introduce themselves here first, and then I'm going to run through just a couple slides, and then we're going to have some questions. We're going to answer your questions. We'll focus on your questions unless no one raises their hand. And then at the end, there's the interpretive dance segment, which I think you'll like.
Hey everybody, my name is James Portnow. Most of you have heard this spiel before. I'm a game designer by trade. I've worked on games from Farmville to stuff by Square Enix to Call of Duty to League of Legends to whatever. I teach, and I'm better known for writing a show called Extra Credits. That's me.
Yeah. With Peter Schmidt, I work on mostly tabletop games as game designer for Bob Gong, which is what I'm probably best known for. Teach critical game analysis, which is sort of how to review a game. And I make some games on Facebook with friends, or on Kickstarter with some friends, with a company called Fun to Live. This is my third panel in a row, so I'm a little tongue. There you go.
Hi, I'm Dan Gronsky, and I'm trying to break everything up here. I'm a PhD. I concentrate on media studies. I mostly do film studies, but I do game studies as well. And I've been doing stuff here at MAGFest for the last, like 4 years now. So hopefully you see me around.
Hi everybody, I'm Sujan Shrestha. I'm a faculty at the University of Baltimore at the game design program. I teach game design, but primarily this panel was interested because I was doing my research a little bit on the evolution theory and game development, so we'll talk about that a little bit.
All right, so what is this panel about? Well, we all know that there are slides that don't advance, and we tell them to. There are lots of things that get studied in high school and colleges, sort of a liberal arts education. You have film studies, you have art studies. My school had a class on 20th century sitcoms, I think, to take. And the question of this panel is, do games belong on this list? The reason those other things are studied is pretty clear. They either reflect the culture, or they move it forward, or they have something to offer us about the times they were in. So, why are they studied? They can't be avoided. Every movement has a soundtrack. Every historical period leaves a record of something that they have, and our games are record. And it's not like they haven't been around for a while, right? They've been around for a long time, and you still probably can't take a class on the social impact of games. Which leads to the question, is the fact that they are seen as only a distraction the reason they will be studied? Games as a whole, it's what we did when we couldn't do something? Or will they be studied for some greater reason because they taught us something about ourselves and about the culture around us? Here's 3 quick slides on a comparison. This person will be studied. Right? She is culture. She's done some amazing things. I'm actually a big fan. Her last album deal was considered revolutionary. She pre-sold the streaming rights for her last album to Apple for $12 million. And that sum of money was amazing. The digital revolution sort of destroyed the music industry, and she found a way around it. But then there's this. This isn't a far along example. It's a few months ago, right? Destiny. Do I just mean nothing? Am I just a distraction? Maybe. And this one, which apparently has, this is taken from another presentation I've done, so we're just going to do. Okay.
Technology will fail.
There we go. So Harry Potter, biggest movie launch of all time, the biggest series of books of all time, I believe, did $483 million. This essentially know-nothing game, not a sequel, no star power, crushed it. And that's just on launch, right? So, do games deserve some respect? Now I'm done. I'll just pose this first question to the panel, and I'll answer it. Are games having a meaningful effect on how we interact with each other and how we judge ourselves? These are good.
That is a really, really interesting question that is really hard to answer. I'm concentrating really on the second part there, how we judge ourselves. And the more I think about it, the more I think the answer is yes, especially when we are not good at that. How many people in here have felt bad about ourselves when we weren't good at a game? And I think if you start counting not just video games, if you start counting, sports, which are definitely games, that is like literally everyone in the world.
And I mean, I was actually going to do the exact same thing, right? How many of you guys feel like you've had a meaningful experience that has made you understand something about yourself within a video game? Right, that's most of us. I think this is actually fairly straightforward.
Yeah. I will say it has socially changed the way we interact with each other. If you watch high school kids today on a date or a multiple date, you will often see them playing console games. As a meaningful interaction at a time when we are forming, that is now being huddled around the campfire of a console, which is new. All right, for the end here. Does a game need to be popular to matter?
Most art that has mattered has not been popular in its time.
I don't know if you can say most, but there's definitely a significant volume of work that was not popular when it came out. And that's sort of a weird thing. I've talked about this in the context of film studies a lot, actually, because film studies really does concentrate on the artsy kind of films, the prestigious pictures. And when you look at something like James Cameron's Avatar, which, let me tell you right now, I've never been more wrong about anything than I was about Avatar, because I was like, this thing is going to tank, this is a disaster. And it is the highest grossing worldwide motion picture of all time. I was way off based on that. And I think, like, if you're going to study film and what film means to human society, you have to look at the films that people watch. People didn't just watch Avatar, they watched Avatar. And just because I personally didn't see the appeal doesn't give me the right to say, I live in an ivory tower and this film is bullshit and we're going to talk about something else. Which happens.
But I do think it is a valid question of, will Avatar matter in 150 years? And we look at a lot of great literature, great philosophy, a lot of this stuff, I mean, even great art, right? Great painting. A lot of these things were not as popular as the pop culture of their day. And I think pop culture is incredibly important and incredibly worth being studied, but I think that it shows us how little popular reception to overall impact on humanity correlate.
Can I respond back to that? I don't know. Sure. Yeah, just to respond back to that very quickly. I mean, again, coming from film, there's a lot of stuff back at the beginning, like D.W. Griffith, who invented a lot of what we consider the modern language of filmmaking, how you cut, how you edit, stuff like that. Was tremendously popular in his day, and if you ask the average Joe on the street, he was D.W. Griffith. They don't know. So, I mean, important in 100 years is like a contextual question. Important how, important to who.
So, I would rather go in a little bit in a different alignment rather than a game need to be popular or what does a popular game does to us. I mean, the term of popular game is very different than does the game needs to be popular. And I was in diversity panel before, right before this. I don't know how many people were there, but it brings up an interesting question on what happens with the popular games and how does it change the socioeconomic, race, gender, age, and all different varieties of things, and how does that changes to our society, not only just in America, but also outside. Who we play with, how we play with, how do we represent to ourselves? Are you associating yourself to a certain group of people, or is it associating with certain countries, certain look? And it does matter. It does make a difference on how we see ourselves, how we see other people. Film studies showed in the previous, I was making a comment earlier, at time, the look mattered. If you were a Russian look, then you're in the film. You're always a villain in a film at one point. Now if you go to the games, there are a lot of Middle Eastern in the games that always get killed. But what about that perception change? What if you're playing a game as a Middle Eastern? What happens then? How does that affect that particular socioeconomic? I mean, I argue about the Call of Duty and other games, and the other phenomena is also the idea of acceptance. How are we accepting these games? What's happening when we accept these games from the cognition perspective? In terms of why are we accepting, it's a very interesting question. It's like your parents telling us, our parents telling us don't do drugs, but we did it anyway. right? Don't smoke pot. We smoked it anyway. Don't eat French fries from McDonald's because it can kill you, but I'll go and eat it anyway. Guess what? Don't smoke cigarette. It will kill you eventually, but I'll smoke it anyway. So why do we do it? And that's the part that we would probably argue a little bit.
No.
And just one thing, by the way, the reason I was giving you some pushback is because as a consulting designer, I work with a lot of AAA companies, and all that matters. All I hear all the time is what matters is how many dollars it brings in, right? How many people play it. And so I just need to give the pushback that it does matter, right? It is important. Pop culture is important, but it is not the only important thing.
So in the last panel, I put up something that looks like your question to the answer. The panel I was in earlier was, is it okay to like terrible things? Which I loved. That was a great panel. And that's sort of like the panel of, is it okay to like something that other people think is offensive? Then we went on to diversity. Let's try not to be offensive. And now we're in, what are people going to look back at? Are they going to look back at us being offensive? Are they going to look back at the first game that brings people together in a meaningful way? What does it mean to make a game where you make your enemies of a place and time? They're Russians. Versus you make a game like Minecraft, where you still have the race of Steve, but that game is infinitely playable across the world at a very low price. Now a kid from a much poorer neighborhood can interact with a kid from a much rich neighborhood on exactly even footing.
No, not always exactly.
Well, not always exactly, but close. I worked with this game Bakugan, and I worked with Pokemon, the trading card game, when it first came out. And I saw kids who would interact with each other in a way they would never do it. They're at an airport, they're waiting for a plane. You have Bakugan, I have Bakugan. Let's talk about our Bakugan. That's why I love cosplay, right? It's like the instant in. Oh, you like that too? Oh, you've got pine cones. Let's talk pine cones, right? It's awesome. All right, so I don't know if I'm at, will they be studied for their social impact? How else are games affecting the way we interact with each other?
I don't have to use it.
Oh.
This way I can object to just whatever you say.
Okay, that is a tricky question for me personally. For me personally.
No, it's not.
Because this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, the way I study things typically. But you're absolutely right about the fact that it's going to be those ones that have that big multicultural, multimedia component to them. I think it's actually going to wind up being stuff like Candy Crush, mobile gaming.
So I think a social reflection is going to be very interesting, right? Because we look back today and we see old movies with white men in blackface, or with Indians rather than Native Americans who are just there to be shot, and we feel shame, right? We feel embarrassed about seeing some of those films. And like 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we may look back at some of our FPSs that we're just churning out today and feel exactly the same way. So I think that reflection, we need to think about how it reflects on us. But I think it also has a lot of social impact. Like you were saying, people playing together. Many of you heard my story last time about people learning about other cultures by playing games online, and all of a sudden that culture becomes real to them, right? These aren't just abstract people you hear about on the news, but real human beings who like the same thing you do. So I think that's just a huge part of bringing us together in a way that no other media can.
I agree with you.
I feel like we're at a point in time that will at least be studied, I will say for sure. I believe that there was always a stigma to being geek, and now we're the records that we want, right? Everything that we think is cool, the rest of the world now thinks is cool. When the Green Bay Packers come out as Settlers Catan players, and you know, everyone's parents have a game on their phone and they're playing Candy Crush. We've reached a point where it is going to change the way we interact with each other. It's given us one more human thing in contact, and that can be good and bad. In the 1950s, more divorces were caused by bowling than anything else. Because for the first time in history, people got together based on what they liked to do, not who they happened to live next to. So there's a lot of interesting social things that can happen with games, that can change just because of the way we play and the way we talk to each other.
So I'm just going to give you one example, not to offend anybody, but just my own experience of being an American. So if I'm walking the street in downtown Baltimore, somebody will say, "Come hi" to me, and the next question usually would be, "Where are you from?" I always wonder why that question's always been asked to me, even if I'm an American. And then once I start speaking, usually people would say, well, you are American. But I tell them, I'm not American. Why is that even relevant? Why do I have to explain to people whether I'm American or not American based on my look and the way I speak? I didn't start speaking until 15 years ago, basically. So this is, just because I lost an accent doesn't mean I lost my identity for who I am. And sometimes games can do that for you. I think it's a media representation is sometimes hugely in our cognition, sometimes dependence. It is a dependence. And sometimes it changes social parameters of how we live and how we interact with other people in a social scope.
All right, so this next question is, sort of goes to that Lady Gaga thing. Even our AAA titles, we don't have a creator culture of star power. Now, when you get really in the weeds with you, we do, right? But we don't have a Mozart. You know, someone says, who made Call of Duty? Who made, well, except for Minecraft, that's the one really bizarre exception to this rule. You can nail that on one guy, almost exclusively. So, are we going to have that breakout person that changes something or is viewed as in Myers too, as the guy or the lady who does it, or are we going to be reliant on the character themselves, like a character that makes us look at people differently and change things around? Or do we have examples of that already?
I'm waiting for him to talk.
Well, this is an interesting one because it's got a direct parallel to film studies. The cult of star power, a personality of fame, and it would be, I'll just say it would be stupid to say that games will never have somebody like that. That's just how, as a society, especially in America, how we do things. We will find somebody and make them a star. On the other hand, I really think that a lot of times, like, it's not that stars have no value, they definitely have value. They bring interest, they bring money and revenue to projects that they're on. I think a lot of times star power gets overestimated. The importance of star power gets overestimated. And I think the games industry so far is a bit of a testament to that. That you do have certain star creators, you have guys that people buy their games. People buy Miyamoto games. If his name is on the game, I buy the game. But we have a lot of games that, you know, Call of Duty. Who makes Call of Duty? Who gives a shit? It's Call of Duty. And that's the star. The star is Call of Duty. So it's an interesting parallel, but also an interesting split, I think. And I'm going to say it matters, but possibly not as much as we might immediately think that it would.
So, I think that we in some ways have something even cooler than star power, right? Like, yes, it's important. Stars are clearly a cultural touchstone, but they are a cultural touchstone for themselves and not necessarily the media that they're in, right? We talk about Tom Hanks' life or whatever, right? And not necessarily him as representing the films that he's been in, or the characters he's played. But in games, we do have stars. We have star characters. We've seen, I mean, walking through these halls, you can see people adopting the roles of those characters, becoming those characters as they become them in games. Mario is as well known as Mickey Mouse, right? There have been studies that have shown this. So we have these stars, but they aren't other people. They're not people we can't be, right? You look at your Lady Gaga or whomever, and most people say, well, that can't be me, right? You look at Toby Bryant or whatever, and you just go, that's somebody else. He's awesome, but he's not me.
That's a really, I keep getting this too close to my mouth, I'm sorry. It's a really excellent observation because, like, there's so much aspiration to movie stars. I want to be like Tom Hanks. I want to have his life. I want to be famous and respected like Tom Hanks. I want to be handsome like Tom Hanks. I want to be Mario. Give me 2 minutes. I will be Mario. In fact, Mario's nobody without me.
I think that we will have star power in this industry, and I think it'll be subversive. I think the guy who made Angry Birds, star power. And because he did it the way he did it from where he did it. I think the first game you play that's amazing, and you find out that the person who made it looks nothing like you, and comes from a culture nothing like yours, but you love their game, I think that'll take him from the behind the curtain and turn her into the most amazing thing you've ever seen. It's an amazing opportunity because there is a break between the designer or designers, the artists, and the player. We don't get to see them. But I think when that curtain comes up, we're going to be stunned at who's making games that entertain us in 20 years. It's going to be awesome.
And that's sort of an interesting thinking too. It's sort of a pet saying of mine, is that technology makes the world a smaller place. It brings you closer into contact with other people. And as somebody who's had the opportunity to actually travel to other places around the world and meet people from places that are not the place I grew up, what you start to learn is that people are kind of people wherever you go. Obviously there are cultural differences, but you have a lot more in common with somebody on the other side of the planet than you might think that you do, just because you've never met them before. The technology of games lets us meet these people from the other side of the world and lets us see they are people just like us.
That's what's good.
I'll just make a small comment on it. I'm not going to get into the fight with these guys. I'm looking from the work perspective a little bit on the star power. It's all about perspective, right? So if you go to Eastern Europe, places like Berlin, Germany, a board game has a more star power than a video game that we actually play in America. And so if you go to...
Sorry, just guessing your comments.
Oh boy. Going to Paris in China, you go there are board games that has a more popular version of it than actually a video game. Well, two reasons. One, accessibility, resources, and various other factors. But the fact that these games have more star powers than the electronic video game has to do something with it. The way it shapes the culture, the way they think, the way they cook, the way they live, the way they dress, the way they look. All different kind of things that has been come out of these. So that's just my short on that one. I didn't know you were going to this.
No, I love tabletop. I love tabletop. All right, so I mentioned I come from a tabletop background, and I'm going to answer my own question. I love this question. So tabletop games, they're the step shop, right? We don't make nearly as much money. Every time I walk into a place and people ask me what I do, and I say I make games, they go, "Oh, you make computer games?" And I just give up and I say yes. I essentially pretend to be here. It's easier for me. But interestingly, tabletop games are unique in this that I have to sit across the table from you and look at you in the face. And there's lots of developmental work on picking up micro expressions, how you can tell intuitively if someone can lie. And that's a lot easier to pick up when you look at people. There are people who believe, I do not believe this is true, that if you spend your time gaming like this, instead of like this, that you will start to lose that ability. And if that happens, that will definitely be studied. But I believe tabletop games will be more popular because they tend to last longer. Call of Duty 3 comes out, Call of Duty 4 comes out, Call of Duty 3 goes away. Settlers of Catan, being played for 20 years, will be played essentially forever. It could become a monopoly that people talk about.
Well, and I was just going to say, maybe just so we just did an episode on Chutes and Ladders and all the amazing meaning that actually is deep within that game. But there is more literature written on both philosophy and strategy of Go than any computer game or video game that's ever been made.
Well, computer games, we ever have a computer game that hangs out forever?
So this is the question. When I talk to other video game designers, one of the big goals, the goal of Go is making the next soccer, right? Not making the next Call of Duty. That's not the real goal. The goal is, how do we do this thing that's going to last forever? There's a lot of debate. We could have a whole panel on esports and people trying to establish that a game which is a perpetual game.
I have a question for you on that front, which is going back to something you mentioned before, which is that money is very, very important. Do companies have a vested interest in not making a permanent game?
So they did until we found out ways to monetize, repeat monetize, right? When you bought something at $6 in a box, absolutely, we had to turn out something every year, right? That's why Madden came out every single year. But now, if we can just sell it to you a roster update digitally, well, maybe we can keep the core of Madden the same and keep players playing with the same rule set, except for the NFL or whatever switches the rules. But now that we've found other ways to monetize it, it's become possible.
I'm going to keep bringing up Minecraft because it's such a big deal. Minecraft could be that game. The problem with yes, right there.
So you brought up Go, and I've played Go before. I like it. It's 3,000 years old. But what would you have said if Go was, say, as old as Minecraft? What would you compare them then? Would they still be philosophy books written on Go, or was there, if Minecraft was 4,000 years old, would there be philosophy books written
There are a shocking number of books written on Minecraft, actually.
Yeah.
It makes me super happy. So I spent the last 7 months doing consulting in Europe. I haven't been home. This is the first time I've been in the United States in 7 months. And everywhere I went, no matter what country, no matter what language, I would go to bookstores. And they would have tons of books. At this point, mostly aimed at younger children, but some of them not actually books on how to play the game, but books about like things you could learn from playing Minecraft, or stories about or in the world of Minecraft. And so, I think it's far too early to say about probably 2,900 some odd years, but I think maybe. I think it's possible. I just think that we can't. The only reason I brought up Go like that is because the question was, could board games possibly be that relevant? Yes. That doesn't mean that video games can't be either, right? And I think it's definitely possible.
I think if we get a digital game that becomes Go, it'll be essentially free at some point. The profit motive does, when you say Go, I'm like, oh, you played the new Go expansion. And because I didn't have to say that, and you still want to play the game, it makes sense to me. It is very easy to copy a game that's stagnant.
Yeah.
So the desire to make Madden next year is to add a little bit more, make it a little harder to catch us, a little bit different, a little bit interesting. You don't do that to Go. So I think the digital game will have to be something that somebody makes and then says, world, it's yours. It's past making money for me.
And I think a lot of those games like that, something they have in common is that they actually have incredibly simple rule sets that become incredibly complex as they spread out. And that sort of simplification of the concept, I think is sort of the key to it. So it sort of negates the idea of expansions and DLC and stuff like that.
Everybody familiar with the term network externality? Doesn't matter. All that means is the value of a game that you play is not based on how much it costs. It's based on how many people you know or might interact with also play. So Magic the Gathering could be a game that matters in this way because although they do expansions, the network of Magic the Gathering players is so big that a new game can't come along and copy it because it's using all of the existing Magic the Gathering players. I can tell you a game way better than Magic, designed by the same guy who will tell you it's way better than Magic. And Magic's still a better experience because that's what everyone else who plays card games is playing. All right.
I'm going to wait till Luke goes to the next slide.
There you go. Okay, so Ivory Tower. I describe the Ivory Tower as, people on this panel.
People on this panel, I like that.
Yeah.
I count people on this panel.
Yeah. But we spend some of our time with clients doing consulting about real-world issues, and then we spend some of our time thinking about the future, like this panel, and larger issues.
And the rest of it complaining about those clients.
Only with other NDA-protected people. Yeah.
So complaining about the people who pay your bills is kind of a national pastime, and you get right down to it.
Yeah. So we play these Ivory Tower games designed that are to teach you about a simple concept. We heard about some in the last panel. What was the one game where you had to work as a team to get something done? Every time you gave someone a direction, they all turned wacky ways. Or a game that sort of really pushes into your face how you judge things by color first and not by behavior.
Black light.
Yeah. So, do these games matter in long term?
Have you all heard of Train?
Yeah.
Some of you, I've seen some no's. Okay, so Train, Brenda Bratway made a game, Brenda Romero now. She made a game that was fairly simple. And there's only one copy of this game in existence, right? It's a very Ivory Tower game. We can only play it at very few art installations and gatherings. But it was this game where it was about, you had this little train, and you had all these little figures, and you moved from stop to stop, and it has some pretty simple rules about trying to get the most of these little figures on this train before it got to the end of the track. And in each station, you flipped over the name of the station, and you kept going, and the last station is Auschwitz. And by this point, you've stacked in your little people upside down and sideways, and you've crammed them in however you can. And you did it all just because the rules told you that's what you were supposed to do. You didn't ask what the end was, you didn't ask what the end goal, you didn't think about any of these things. And this is a game I encourage you all to look up, right? But, I mean, even by me saying it here and then you going out and telling your friends, this game will have an effect. And I've seen many of the independent game designers who are trying new things always go back and reference this game, even though there's only one copy of it in existence. So I do think that these games have an impact.
I think they absolutely have an impact, especially in terms of play mechanics. Because it's the people that are thinking about play mechanics that are going to figure out how do we improve them, how do we come up with new ones, how do we build on what we've already got. And even if that game itself doesn't necessarily make a big splash among regular people, that's going to reach the other people that make games. They're going to make the big, AAA titles that do reach millions of people, and those mechanics are going to spread out from there.
I think it's just not it's not just these small games, indie games, but I want to kind of get into a little bit of Title I games that actually do teach us some of these contexts as well. I mean, you have to think about consciously about it. I mean, I wouldn't, until I played Call of Duty, I just did not understand how the racial division in the games happen, right? So there are other games too, of course. But even in Title I games, I mean, and James can probably tag along on this one, there are places in context to where it does matter for what we learn and how it actually impacts us directly over and over again. It's a matter of thinking. It's a matter of how we see these things in a clear sense or not. Or we're just playing game just to replay value, or just playing game because I can't finish that level and I want to finish that level just because I'm a gamer. So the player perspective is a critical piece of this context. It's a huge piece.
So James here did a bit on narrative in games and why it's challenging that we tend to remember the things we do in games, not the actual stories there. I just want to talk to that because obviously the stories are infinitely studyable and can be incredibly powerful when you look at history. Some books have been written that have just changed the world, right? So can a game get there? And what are the big challenges? And I'm just going to hand the mic to you guys.
So I think there's a lot of different answers to this. In one sense, it's the fault of us as an industry because we've sort of trained the player to not play for anything but the most superficial play, right? And not for the rest of the context, to not spend more time thinking about it. I mean, I know that sounds weird, but we've been hiding behind this idea that we're just making a pastime, that we're just making games for a very long time, and I think that has affected how we market to our audience and how we address our audience. You hear all the time, you get blowback whenever you say, hey, there's more to this game. You'll get people, especially on the internet, pushing back saying, oh, don't add all this meaning to my game, right? We've trained that into this audience, so we have to get past that. Also, I think that stories are hugely important, and there's a lot, I mean, people will talk about Bioshock story all the time, but very often we'll talk about specific moments with it. But also within this context, because you live them, choices and characters are as important as story, and I think that those have huge meaning, right? The characters we associate with tell us something about ourselves. The choices we make within these games tell us something about ourselves. And so, as much as narrative, I think there's this new form of, I don't know exactly what I would call it. I mean, it's sort of narrative, but of associative experience that we get in games that we don't necessarily get in other media.
There's a gentleman in the back there who's been patiently waiting.
The prior forms of art for games have all been a distillation of experience either in a single painting or a story is told, whereas games is you're no longer experiencing someone else's perception of whatever experience or story they're trying to tell you. You are participating in it. And so if you start telling story via gameplay, like with Paper Please or that train game you were talking about, there's not narrative there, but there's story that you're.
And your story will be different from anyone else's who plays it.
But not necessarily. Like the trains game, if you just do it and whether you pack it completely full or not, it's still a sort of a, oh shit, when you get to that last station. But and like with Paper Please, you know, in the 1984 setting, and it's more, it can be a shared experience across, much like the stories as told in book or art or paintings, but it's a more personal shared experience.
Game designers, I say all the time, we don't get to make an experience. We make a fun room. We make a room and we hope that your time in that room is fun. And if we make it the right way, it'll more or less be fun most of the time. But everything you brought in is with you, and every decision you make is yours, hopefully. But as a narrative, we have a lot of control over narrative as game design. Even just the setting we pick. And I think as the tools become more and more available, we're going to see some stories told in settings that just make us cry. Right?
That's a big part of any kind of storytelling too, especially like in film. People talk about like, the objectivity of a documentary, but there's no such thing. Where you put the camera, who you choose to talk to, where do you edit the clip at? Everything becomes part of that narrative storytelling. And I did do a panel on video game narratives here last year, and one of the things we talked about is that big dichotomy between the story that you're trying to tell and the story that the player is developing on their own. Because, unless you're playing a visual novel, at which point it's right there in the genre description, it's a novel, you're reading a story. The things you do will always have some sort of an impact on your play experience, even if the narrative itself is completely scripted.
And I think you raised an important distinction, right? In every other media, whether it be a painting or a film or a book, you're interpreting someone else's perspective, right? You're getting the ideas of an author or a director. Whereas in games, you really are, we define the boundaries of the experience, but you are defining the experience for yourself. And so even in something like Train, which is completely linear in some ways, the reason you have that horrific moment at the end is because you realize, why didn't I ask why, right? Throughout the entire time, you're being told to stack all these guys on here. And I just follow these rules. I never asked why. It's because you had that agency, you had that opportunity to change the experience, to walk away, and you didn't take it, right? That's the thing that Spec Ops is challenging you for all the time. And so, in all of these things, we also have this unique relationship in games that we don't have in other things, where we're not just receiving someone else's perspective, but also imparting our own.
All right. Oh, yes, absolutely. This is the last one. All right, go. Question?
When you talk about the different stories, like, I understand that stories would be studying games, but like, I went to college, I was in all my time in the English department. What do you think it would take, or what would be your argument to studying these stories with the impact they are, to studying them the same way? Because I even studied comic books and film, but what would be your argument that those stories are just as important?
Well, the problem I've always had doing video game studies in an academic environment isn't that it's not hard to make the argument that they're just as important. It's actually a very easy argument to make. The problem is that the medium itself, it's a long-form medium that requires sort of a base level of competency at fulfilling the objectives, whatever they might be. It's sort of one of the weird things is you go to school for, 12 years prior to that point, and I'm pretty sure that you can read. You can read American English because you've taken many classes on it and people have yelled at you if you failed to do it correctly. I don't know that you can complete Super Mario Brothers because no one has ever made you do that. And that becomes sort of like, there are a bunch of little variables like that you start to think about, how would I put this class together? Because I feel like I could very easily pitch it to a curriculum committee and get that put on the curriculum of my college. Like, we're going to study video games. It's going to be an arts elective and a humanities elective. There's a lot to learn from that. There's a lot of academic value to it. But how do you do it? Like how do you set the class up? A theory, a story, a narrative class like that. Design is, I don't want to say easy is the wrong word, but like there is a way to do that academically in 15 weeks. To do, if I wanted to study Okami in 15 weeks, I don't know that I could do it.
If you don't sleep with it.
Yes, if it is literally 15 full weeks.
How much time do we have left? You wanted to start taking more questions? Or?
Yeah, I want to answer that question though too. I don't think necessarily we've seen the best story from games yet. I don't think we've seen the story that changes the world. I do think we've seen games change society by how we interact with each other. And I think that is already worth studying. I'm waiting for the great story that makes us all go, oh my gosh, we need to totally not do something. And there's some ivory tower games that are trying, but no more oil. We're not using oil anymore. I played this game and oil is so bad, I'm not using oil. That's what I want to just yet.
So I actually think we also have to think about how we study these differently, whether it be take smaller sections Or, for example, I was just in Norway and there was a guy who was teaching ethics through The Walking Dead. But I think that in doing so, they did a better analysis of The Walking Dead than I had ever seen before. Rather than taking our standard literary analytics tools, we have to think about new ways of exploring these that we haven't established yet. I mean, even in the same way when you talk about comic books, that wasn't as different of a medium as games are by a huge margin, and yet before we could academically study those, there was a bunch of things that we had to understand about the medium of comics. And I don't think we've established those for games yet.
Yes.
All right, about the question if a game can change the world or change how people view the world, like a single game having that kind of cultural impact. And I think it kind of, asking that question kind of begs the question, is it possible for anything to change the world? Movies, music, or literature to change the world like that anymore, because we live in such a connected world where there's so much books being published, so many movies being made, where it's not like back in 100 years or so ago, where you could where just the fact that you could get published, it was a very small market out there, very small amount of competition, so it was very easy to stand out. Whereas now, there's so much, it's even possible for something to stand above the crowd in any medium, not just games.
Yes.
And then should we be holding video games to that standard?
So the term for that situation is postmodern, right? Is it so easy to make stuff that nothing has a chance to rise? Because once it starts to rise, everyone copies it and it brings it back down to the bottom. I still think it's possible. And I think with social media it's even more possible, and I think the world perspective is that's when you can really make a difference. When you make a game that makes people want to interact with people from a different area of the world in a different way, I think it could catch on fire like Settlers of Catan has.
I would even say that, I mean, I've argued this in videos before, but I think the world will be a fundamentally different place because this generation was brought up on Minecraft rather than being brought up on FPSs. I think that actually will fundamentally affect the generation.
We'll find out, right?
Also want to point out, just trying to catch up on a couple of questions that we had earlier too. How many people have seen the movie called Rashomon? Okay, so if you haven't seen it, I think you should see it. I think games.
Everyone should see it.
There are other movies too, but I just came up to my brain. But the idea of Rashomon effect is actually what we see in games. So is that going to be a better game? We're going to change the world? I think, my opinion, I don't know. I think it's a very interesting question. I always tell my son, don't be violent. The first thing as a boy he does is something kicking or something violent. So I can't really tell when he gets older if he's not going to be violent at all. So the idea is, where does he take that violence into that level? Whether it's going to perpetuate something different or something he starts to calm down and start to see humanity as a humans. So that is the bigger, larger question I think we're trying to.
All a game has to do to change the world is change one person who becomes a leader. That's it.
And I would say actually even thinking about the story or the game that will change the world is even the wrong way to look at it, because I think it's going to be the stories that change the world. It's going to be the games that change the world and how they work together. And maybe there won't be that one game that says we're not using oil anymore, or democracy is a fool's errand. We need kings again. Maybe it will be 6 or 10 games in a row that come together that form this canon, and that's going to be the change.
Yes.
How would you contextualize establishing canon in games, being that the medium is so young, in that you're taking we go from Pong to Super Mario to even say Genesis games, Sonic, and then just going up through the timeline. How do you establish an actual canon to be studied in a way that establishes to just teach people that this is where we come from, this is how important this is, and this is the roots of video games?
Oh, this one's an easy one. The same way we've done everything else. 5 people will pick a canon, and then 25 people will tell them they're assholes and wrong. And that will continue for about 150 years.
That's way in the back.
Yes, Dave, you talked about these multiple milestones. Do you think in the next, like, say, couple of years, you said we want to look back and review the FPSs of how we look at the news and stuff. Do you think that is actually the reverse might be true, or something like saying we should do more, or something like that? Because with reactions to what's going on today, it just seems like people will use tragedies, like say what's happening at the French, or say see all people really like this. There might be more people looking at Muslims, people who are Islamic, as negative.
So I'll make sure I'm summarizing your question correctly. It was, do you think in the future that games could have a negative impact, or where Minecraft presents FPS as a positive, or maybe there's a negative where they see things on the screen and they start acting out in that way? I'll make sure.
Yeah, that's negative. That's not the world around it sees it negative. And
oh, even though us in this room might think it's fine. Yeah. Well, if you watch the 700 Club, you would know that D&D is going to make us all Satan-worshipping child killers.
And now back to Tom Hanks.
And now we're back to Tom Hanks.
And that's a problem you run into with just about anything, actually, is the echo chamber. And I love you guys, you're all great guys, but here's the thing, we get in a room, we start talking to each other, we're all gonna wind up with the same opinion at the end of the day. And then are we right? How do we know? Because we just keep reinforcing each other. And that happens everywhere, and that happens with bad opinions, that happens with good opinions. And it's a dangerous thing to watch out for, but it's very, very hard to see it when it's happening to you.
Yes, second row. Yeah.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to bounce off what you were saying about the history thing, and I'd like to say there are already a number of really cool books, and I'd like to direct you and anyone else in the room interested in history stuff to this book called The Ultimate History of Video Games. It's this textbook-sized book, and it talks a lot about the history of games, particularly a period that I find gets skipped over a lot, which is the time between when video games were invented and when they failed. That entire period is skipped, and there's a lot that can be learned from that period, and that book talks about a lot of that stuff. Highly recommend it. But my question was, or I guess my point I want to make though is that going back to the sort of thing about how we're actually reading games, I think the problem is that I think a lot like we kind of used to with comics, I think we're still reading games a lot in the same way that we want to read books or movies. We keep saying looking forward to these stories. I mean, going back to Train, it's really easy to look at Train and say the message of Train is that the Holocaust was bad, but obviously, that goes without saying, and that comes across when you find out the reveal of the Auschwitz thing. But what makes Train such an experience is that the interactivity means that there are a number of sort of ways that can play out for each person that informs what Train is, because you can't just automatically assume that the end point of the game is that someone's going to play the game and then they're going to realize what they did is bad, because I've heard people played it and they'll keep playing, and someone will be like, well, why are you doing this? And it's well, my guy's a conductor and he has a family to feed, or someone sees a game and they see it immediately and they get what it is and they say, I'm not playing, and that in and of itself is still playing the game. And the thing is that's not looking at the narrative or the story that the game's explicitly telling, it's looking at what the mechanics say about the game. And I think that's the kind of narrative you'd be looking at, not sort of this, this beginning, middle, end narrative or story, but rather the narrative that the players get from the experience of actually playing and interacting with the game. And that's what makes games such an awesome and unique experience. And I think that's what makes them art and what we need to be looking at when we say games are art and what and games and art needs to be studied.
That's a great point, and it's something actually that came up in the problematic games panel earlier today. What's your takeaway? Where does it come from? The death of the author thing. The intention is to teach you that the Holocaust is bad. That doesn't mean your takeaway is not going to be, must have been really hard to be a good Nazi filling these trains. This is really difficult work. Wow, getting the trains to run on time is a real accomplishment. And you don't know what someone's going to take away. And what they do take away is their takeaway. You can't tell them they're wrong for doing that.
Yeah. Let's go somewhere right there behind the, you.
So earlier you talked about the depiction of groups in video games and how that's a stark contrast to what we sort of talk about every day. And you also talked about how we trained people to look at games as just diversions where we accomplish objectives without caring about the story. But I really don't think it's something that originates in games themselves. I mean, you don't exist in a vacuum. You're being informed by what we purchase and what we demand. We've demonstrated how we feel about things subconsciously through the games we ask you to make. And there's times where we don't want a story. We want to be distracted. I mean, the reason why people play chess again and again and again is because they want to know why. These two sides are fighting. They want to keep recreating the battle between the two.
Yeah. No, I think this speaks just exactly what I was saying before, and it mixes in a little bit with the financial realities, right? You tell us as a room of game players.
And that goes for other art as well. I mean,
Yeah.
most paintings, books, movies, they're what the culture wants to see and how it feels, not something that the artist wants to inform the culture about.
Yeah, there's business-driven art or craft, and then there's personal-driven art. And I would say that Trains game was not made to make much money.
Given that there's one copy that's never been sold, I probably.
It belongs in a museum.
So we've created an interactive forum in games, and the people who are interested in money are going to look at a room like this and go, what kind of games does this room want to play? What are they playing now? And none of them's going to say Trains.
We're going to pay them to do that.
Yes, and you're going to pay us, and we're going to look at how you vote with your money.
And that's,
But artists, as the tools get pushed down, it'll be easier and easier for real artists to just do real art for art's sake and try to make a point.
and that's sort of the thing, is sometimes I feel bad for Call of Duty because it's become such a whipping boy in our circle, and then I think about how much money it makes, and I stop feeling bad.
So, I mean, there's a number of different things in this room. As far as Call of Duty, at some point we should talk about Modern Warfare 1, because I actually think we don't see it now, but there were a lot of things we were working on that were actually super fun. Like, do any of you guys remember the AC-130 scene in the first Modern Warfare? That was to talk about the remote horrors of modern war, right? Those guys couldn't hurt you. There was nothing they could do to you. And here you were wiping them out while this guy was like, one more for the kill reel.
Yeah.
So there was actually a lot that we were trying to discuss there. But a lot of that gets lost in the way that we, as a culture, digested that work, even as a game creation culture, because it kind of hurts me all the time. I feel like all the wrong lessons as a designer were taken from Call of Duty. I mean, even on just a pure design front, like, do any of you guys remember the training level at the very beginning to help you choose your difficulty? It's one of my favorite things about it. That wasn't picked up by anybody, right? It was just, hey, we can Skinner box the multiplayer, sweet. But as far as money goes, money is a huge motivator for this. I completely agree. I am not convinced, given the economics that I've seen in the games industry right now, that we, as a consuming public, actually want to buy. I mean, there's a reason that Minecraft was bought for $2 billion. There's a reason that we see so many of these studios go under and have these layoffs. I think that you're right, and I think there's nothing wrong with gameplay for gameplay's sake. It's just like I would say, I would never ask you to get rid of blockbuster movies. I like blockbuster action summer movies as much as the next person. It's just that they can't be all we produce. And right now, they're like an overwhelming majority of the AAA space.
If the guy got nothing but candy.
Right.
I like candy. Yes, I can.
So this has to do more, I guess, with the toxicity inherent in certain aspects of the culture. A lot also, as far as looking at the mechanics having to do with multiplayer play, the effects of anonymity on that, and how this culture, both the video games, multiplayer mechanics, and anonymity, kind of came together to create something that has been talked to death over the past year, the whole Gamergate scandal and all of that. How we can avoid moving in that direction in the future and try to prevent that as a culture.
So a couple things real quick. There's a whole Gamergate panel, so we're not going to touch specifically on that. But something we mentioned in...
You can clearly see it on the schedule. I heard you say that before. When is it?
It's very soon. It's like the next.
I think it's in the next block.
I think it's called toxicity in games.
Yeah.
Might be the title of it.
But I will say what we said in the last panel is also true. What you're kind of hearing is the death scream of people losing their power. So this used to be my thing. I used to be better at it than you. Now you're better than me. I'm at home with a headset on. I'm going to stream whatever I want to stream. It will end. The industry, the larger industry, bears some serious responsibilities to look inward as to how they allow people to communicate. Free-form screaming of things over headsets that isn't moderated would not be allowed in almost anything you do at any age until people do it with their parents don't look.
And also how we incentivize people to behave better.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I think it is on us in some ways to create systems within our games that not only punish bad behavior, but also encourage positive behavior. And I mean, it was really until the modern period that we saw laws as to improve the morality of society rather than simply as punitive. And we need to start looking at that way in games. I think that inherent in the design creates the culture of those games.
And I think it's important too that, that sort of prevailing thought to this point has been that, oh, they're just kids and they'll grow out of this. And that's the dumbest way to approach this because we don't know that and they're not.
But it's the easiest way to approach it. As a major corporation, right? That is the easiest line. Yep.
And we have to also recognize that social acceptance is not a click away. It takes a long over time. 20 years ago, if you were born gay or lesbian, imagine how difficult life had been compared to today. It's the same phenomenon. It takes a long time for social structure to change. It's just not a one single day or a month. It's years, it's generations of things. 50 years ago, I would not be sitting here and talking to you guys from this panel group. It would be a completely different scenario for me to do this. It's the same phenomenon. Today, I have the same equal voice to what I do and how I present it. The representation of that took a long time to do. Even in context to America, think about from the world. It is the same phenomenon that's happening in the world. Race, segregation, all different kind of set that we talked about in games throughout this last year. It's happening still today. Slavery still exists in other parts of the world that people have to go through. There's a sex slavery that actually happening in America today that actually does affect us in several ways and the rest of the population. It is an evolving situation. And I think that's where games comes in place. It can change the world in a certain way. And I'm going to go back to Luke's comments in terms of, and defer my own, in terms of why games can change. We can start to think about these. Think about, make people motivated about why these things are important. Why is humanity is one and what is it important to us? What are the people are doing? We start to see, when we see games, I think most of the time we see as a one single entity. We see as a one single country. Sometimes we forget about this planet, and that is the bigger equation of games, where games can start to make us think about one planet, one world, one living thing, and that is the bigger part of this panel, I think.
I would use your term. What was your term? Design creates culture?
Yes.
Yes, great term. I'm stealing it again. Yeah. So what's frustrating me about this topic is it is so easy, in my mind, on the game design side, to fix this. Right? You can really encourage good behavior, and it's not that hard. Even on the tabletop, I worked on a game where it was facing a fantasy version of Japan, and you had to bow to your opponent before you started. That was it. Little tiny thing. It made you respect the person across the table. It would take so little to fix this situation. It's so frustrating from the outside to not see it done. Yes, back there.
Do you think that that's because artists have gotten away from the art and tagging on to what he was saying, they're more obsessed with the money aspect of it. It's more like, okay, I'm broke, I've been living in my car, gotta make this dollar, I don't want to eat McDonald's anymore, and I'm making this money, and it doesn't really matter what the product is that I put out. I don't have to put as much thought into it because I can just do what they tell me to do and put out what's going to sell, as opposed to putting out something that's going to be quality and going to be life-altering for someone.
Well, art has always been commercial. Always, always, always. Go to the Vatican, look at all the pretty paintings of God and Jesus, and realize that they were paid for. But you're right to a commission. Yes, there we go. Patrons, the patron system, because that sounds a lot better. But there definitely is an aspect to that, I think, where at a certain point you can. An irresponsible artist can sort of shut half of themselves down and be like, it's a paycheck. So you're not wrong about that, but this is not a new problem.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we have about 3 minutes left. So any more questions out there? Oh, way in the back. Be loud, it's good.
What's that?
Be loud.
All right. So I don't want to go too far back, but one of the questions I had when you were talking about like people's interpretation of different content, with games like Hatred coming out, where do you find like where's the line drawn? And if games like Patron have a place in the market, do you feel like they need to have some kind of, do you think there should be some kind of ethical requirement with certain games?
Well, I can speak to this.
She thinks.
Yeah, I'll let you do it.
So I will absolutely defend their right to make hatred and say they shouldn't make hatred. I think that game is terrible, is going to be terrible, is a piece of schlock which is going to sell on being a piece of schlock. I will also very much defend Steam's right. I think Steam was right in the first place. They're a private business. They can do whatever they want. They don't have to sell it on their service. And so I think that as an industry, we can internally decide on what our moral standards are. And things will always exist outside that, just like things exist outside the mainstream industry of film. And these things will get created. I think people should be able to create them. I don't think we have to give everything a megaphone. That's what it comes down to.
I'm going to quote an anonymous gentleman from the internet on this, which is to say, I may not agree with your opinion, but I will defend to the death your right to shut up.
All right, we have time for one more. Anyway, all right, right there.
Yay. A few years ago at one of the Games as Arts panel, there was a sociologist, or excuse me, anthropologist who spoke and said one of the things that makes studying games as art difficult is because anthropologically games are seen as a culture piece, not an art piece. And it falls more into the realm of culture and sociology and that when it's classified and not in the realm of arts and classics and literature. And so when you were talking about teaching these classes and so forth, I'm wondering about if it's something that you need to try and pull away from the anthropologists and sociologists to get it into the media studies world.
You know, in our earlier panel, we were talking about, what do you call them, D games there?
H.
H games. Yes, I got my letter wrong there. All right, so this panel is on, is it okay to like terrible things, right? I think those games can teach you about a culture. When I played a terrible game when I was young, which I mentioned the last thing too, about the Mongols. And it was terrible. The things you had to do in that game were terrible. But it taught me what you had to do to be a Mongol. And I felt like I learned something in the process. So I think we do reflect ourselves in our game humanity as a group. You go to the Americans now, a lot of people will say, man, why is it that all Americans play first-person shooters? And America keeps going to war. Someone's going to make that comparison. It's going to be very hard to say that those were just culture, unless they reflect it.
And just to speak about the academic environment, the problem is when you start talking cross-curricular stuff, departments hate each other and fight. Has anyone in here had to deal with that? Yeah, it's a nightmare, right? So if anthropology has something, or if the arts has something and anthropology wants it, the arts won't give it to them, even if they're not using it. Because it's a point of pride, it's a pissing contest. You can't have it. And that's where, as humans, we defeat ourselves.
All future classes will be online. There we go. The world will be yes. All right, I think we're done. Unless,
But while we have to clear out of this room, if you guys want to keep asking questions, I think this discussion is important. I'm happy to be right outside. What about you guys? For at least for a few minutes.
I am good for a half an hour.
Yeah, me too.
So, yeah.
All right.
Thank you.